The moment Elara Voss stepped off the train at Caldwell Station in the Kansas Territory on a sweltering afternoon in June of 1882, she told herself she was not running away. She was simply moving forward, which was an entirely different thing, even if the distinction felt paper-thin when the wind blew dust into her eyes and made them water in a way she was grateful for, because it gave her an excuse for the tears. She had left Cincinnati 3 days prior with a single trunk, a carpet bag stuffed with everything she thought she might need, and a letter of reference from the schoolmaster at the First Episcopal School on Vine Street, where she had taught reading and arithmetic to the children of mill workers for the better part of 3 years. She had not told her mother the truth about why she was leaving. She had simply said there was an opportunity, a teaching position in a frontier town, and her mother had pressed her lips together and looked at her the way mothers look at daughters when they know perfectly well something is being left unsaid. But they also know that pressing any harder will only cause the wound to open up again and bleed all over the clean kitchen table. So her mother had packed her a tin of shortbread cookies and kissed her forehead and said, "Write me." And Elara had said, "Every week," and both of them had believed it mostly. The man she was not thinking about was named Frederick Holloway. He was handsome in the way that certain men are handsome confidently, almost carelessly, as though good looks had been given to him without much effort on his part, and he considered them more or less his due. He was the son of a textile merchant. He had smiled at her across a church social 18 months ago, and she had been, in the only word she could bring herself to use, foolish. She had believed the things he said. She had believed them right up until the Sunday morning when she had walked past the Holloway parlor window and seen him sitting very close to Miss Adeline Prout on the settee, his hand covering hers, his head bent toward her ear in a posture that required no further explanation. Elara had kept walking. She had walked all the way home and sat at her kitchen table and eaten half the shortbread cookies her mother had made for Sunday supper, and felt the particular kind of devastation that comes not only from losing something, but from realizing you had been building a future inside your own imagination, while the person you were building it with had been building something else entirely. The teaching position in Caldwell, Kansas, had been advertised in the Cincinnati Gazette 2 months later. She had answered it the same afternoon she read it. She had told herself it was merely professional ambition. She had kept telling herself that through the entire 3-day train journey, watching the country change from rolling green hills to wide, flat, blazing plains that looked like they could swallow a person whole and never even notice. And now she was standing at Caldwell Station with her trunk on the platform beside her, and the hot Kansas wind rearranging her hair in ways that would have horrified her former self, the self who had carefully pinned everything into place before Frederick Holloway's church socials, and she was looking around for someone from the school board who was supposed to have sent a wagon. There was no wagon. There was, however, a man. He was leaning against the post office wall beside the station with his hat pulled low against the afternoon sun, a position he had presumably occupied for some time, because there was a ring of boot scuffs in the dust at his feet, suggesting considerable patient waiting. He was tall in that particular way of men who have spent their lives outdoors, not performing their height but simply occupying it, wearing it the way he wore his boots and his worn canvas work coat, as something entirely functional and entirely his own. He had a lean, sun-darkened face with a jaw that looked like it had been carved out of the same landscape he worked, and there were laugh lines at the corners of his eyes that suggested someone who found the world more often amusing than not, even when it was hard. He pushed off the wall when he saw her look around, and he walked toward her with the unhurried stride of a man who had learned that urgency rarely improved any situation and often made it considerably worse. "Miss Voss," he said, and she blinked because she had not expected that her name, offered just like that as a quiet certainty rather than a question. "Yes," she said. "How did you know?" He almost smiled. Almost. It was more of a settling, the way a landscape settles after wind, a small adjustment around the mouth and eyes that suggested amusement kept deliberately in check. "Thomas Greer," he said, reaching up to tip his hat in the old courtesy. "I run the freight station here, Mr. Aldridge from the school board asked me to collect you on account of his wagon wheel throwing a shoe this morning. Your name was on the passenger manifest from the Kansas Pacific." He gestured with his chin toward the station window where the station master presumably kept such records. "I figured if a woman got off alone with a trunk, it was probably you." "That is a fair piece of reasoning," she said. "I have my moments," he said, and this time the almost smile became a real one, brief and genuine, and she noticed it with a small, involuntary internal notation before she firmly reminded herself that she had not come all the way to Kansas to notice things like that. He carried her trunk as though it weighed nothing, which she knew it did not, because it was full of books and was in fact extremely heavy, and she had banged her own shins on it twice during the train journey. He set it in the bed of a wagon he had waiting on the far side of the station, a solid and practical wagon with two good bay horses who regarded Elara with the measured calm of animals that have seen everything and considered most of it unworthy of alarm. "How far is it to town?" she asked, climbing up to the bench seat before he could offer to help her, because she was perfectly capable of climbing into a wagon on her own, regardless of what the customs of the day suggested about such things. "This is town," he said, climbing up the other side and gathering the reins with the ease of long habit. "Caldwell's got about 1,500 souls if you count the outlying farms. School's on the north end of the main street. Boarding house where you'll stay is 2 blocks from that." "Have you lived here long?" she asked, mostly to fill the silence as they pulled out into the main street, which was indeed a proper street with a proper saloon and a general store and a land office and a barber shop and all the other organs of a working frontier town going about its daily business in the late afternoon heat. "Born in Missouri," he said. "Came down here in '76, 6 years now. You came for the cattle trade. Started that way. Run the freight station now. It suits me better." She glanced at him sideways. "Better than what?" He considered the question with more seriousness than she had expected. "Better than moving," he said finally. "I spent a few years moving. It gets to feel like running after a while, even when you started out just going somewhere." She looked at her own hands in her lap and said nothing, because she was not entirely certain that observation did not apply to her own current situation in ways she preferred not to examine. He delivered her to the boarding house, which was run by a woman named Mrs. Clara Beaumont, who was somewhere between 50 and 70, had iron-gray hair arranged in a perfectly severe bun, and had the particular warm sharpness of women who have survived a great deal and emerged from it not bitter but simply honest. She showed Elara her room, small, clean, with a window that faced east and caught the morning light, and told her supper was at 6 and that there was no whiskey on the premises, but that what happened at the Rusty Plow Saloon 4 blocks away was not her concern. Thomas Greer had carried her trunk up the stairs before leaving, and at the door he had touched his hat again and said, "Welcome to Caldwell, Miss Voss," and that had been all. She told herself over supper, listening to Mrs. Beaumont describe the town's various personalities with the fond acidity of someone who knew them all very well, that she had not thought about Thomas Greer once since he left. This was not entirely true. The school was a single room with 8 rows of rough-hewn desks, and a chalkboard that had been repaired twice with mismatched wood, and a stove in the corner that Elara was told would become very important come October. There were 23 students ranging in age from 6 to 14, the children of ranchers and farmers and merchants, and 1 girl, a quiet, dark-eyed child named Rosa Medina, whose father ran the tannery at the edge of town, who could already read in Spanish but not yet in English, and who watched Elara in the first days with a combination of wariness and sharp, barely concealed curiosity. The school board met with Elara on her 3rd day in Caldwell. There were 4 members, all men, all ranchers or businessmen of one kind or another, and the chairman, Mr. Harold Aldridge, was a round, prosperous man with excellent manners and considerable condescension, the kind that is so thoroughly habitual its owner has never once been required to examine it. He looked at her credentials from the Episcopal school and her letter of reference, and said that her qualifications were quite satisfactory, with the particular inflection that suggested he had expected satisfactory, and was therefore not especially impressed by it. "You'll find our children are good students," he said. "A little rough around the edges, perhaps, but fundamentally sound." "Children usually are," she said pleasantly, and he blinked at her in a way that suggested he was not entirely sure whether she had said something agreeable or something else. She found her footing in the classroom within the first week. She was good at this. She had always been good at this. And the children, who had apparently had a rather difficult year with a previous teacher who had left in February under circumstances that Mrs. Beaumont described only as not his finest hour, responded to her consistency and genuine interest in them, the way students always respond to teachers who actually see them. Rosa Medina stayed after school on the third Thursday to ask, very carefully, whether Miss Voss might be willing to teach her the English letters the way they sounded, not just the way they looked, and Elara had said yes, of course, and spent an hour with her, and by the end Rosa had read aloud 4 sentences from the primer with a concentration so fierce and proud it nearly broke Elara's heart in the best possible way. She saw Thomas Greer again on Friday of that first week. She was at the general store, Hartley's Mercantile, trying to determine which brand of chalk was less likely to disintegrate mid-lesson, when he came in to collect a freight order of dry goods from Mr. Hartley. He acknowledged her with a nod and the quiet certainty of someone who does not feel the need to perform recognition, and she nodded back, and that would have been the end of it except that on her way out she misjudged the step down from the boardwalk. Her trunk was not the only thing she was prone to misjudging, and the box of chalk she was carrying scattered itself comprehensively across the planked walkway. He was behind her, and he crouched down alongside her without comment and helped her collect the scattered sticks of chalk, which was a simple and unremarkable act, but he did it with the same particular quality she had noticed in him from the start, a kind of unhurried, complete attention to the thing directly in front of him, as though the scattered chalk on a boardwalk in front of Hartley's Mercantile was exactly as worthy of his consideration as anything else might be. "Thank you," she said. "Miss Voss," he said, and started to stand. "Elara," she said, and was mildly surprised to hear herself say it, "if we're to keep running into each other in this fashion." He looked at her with those steady, dark eyes. "Elara," he said, as though he were setting the word somewhere it would stay. "Thomas," she offered back. "Tom," he said. "Everyone calls me Tom." "Tom," she said, and he nodded, and she went back to the boarding house with her chalk and spent the next 20 minutes telling herself that her heart was beating at a perfectly normal rate. It was the middle of July before they had what could reasonably be called a conversation, rather than an exchange of pleasantries and practical information. There was a town gathering that Saturday, the Caldwell Founders' Day celebration, which, according to Mrs. Beaumont, had been a tradition for exactly 4 years, which was not very long for a tradition, but which the town maintained with the enthusiasm of settlers, who are still grateful enough for what they have built to celebrate it with genuine feeling. There were long tables set up in the main street with food contributed by every household, and a fiddler and a guitarist playing near the bank, and children running through the early evening light with a joyful disregard for their good clothes, and the whole scene had a warmth to it that Elara found herself absorbing in spite of her recent conviction that warmth was something she was on a holiday from. Mrs. Beaumont had introduced her to approximately 40 people in the space of an hour, which was well-intentioned and somewhat exhausting, and she found herself after a while standing at the edge of the gathering near the water trough, where the horses were tied, watching the fiddler work his way through a reel with the kind of personal investment that suggested He had feelings about this particular piece of music. "You look like you're studying something," Tom said beside her, and she realized he had come up beside her quietly, the way men who work around horses and cattle develop without meaning to. "The fiddler," she said. "He's angry at that last bar. Did you hear it? The way he drew the bow." Tom listened for a moment with genuine attention. "I think that might just be the way he plays," he said. "Emmett Hale. He's always got a strong opinion about every song he plays." "Does he have opinions about songs he doesn't play?" Tom considered this. "I think he probably has opinions about songs that don't exist yet," he said. She laughed, and it surprised her. Not the fact of it, but the quality of it. Something genuinely loose and unguarded. The kind of laugh she hadn't managed since before the whole Frederick business, since before she'd had to be careful about what she allowed on her face. She looked sideways at Tom and found him watching her with a quiet expression she couldn't quite read, something careful and steady in it, like a man who has found something he wasn't looking for and is taking his time deciding what to do about it. "You don't dance?" she asked, because the question was safe and social and moved the conversation away from his eyes. "I'm capable of it," he said. "I'm not always willing." "What's the distinction?" "Tonight," he said, "I'm willing." And he offered her his hand with the same straightforward economy that characterized everything he did, not performing anything, simply offering. She danced with him. She had been a good dancer all her life, had been told so often enough that she had stopped hearing it as a compliment and simply accepted it as a fact, the way you accept being right-handed. Tom was not a technically accomplished dancer, but he had a natural sense of rhythm and an honest willingness to be in the moment of it. And dancing with someone who is genuinely present is far better than dancing with someone technically perfect who is thinking about something else. She knew about the latter. She had danced with Frederick Holloway twice at the church social, and he had been very good and entirely elsewhere. Afterward they sat on the back steps of the land office where it was quieter, and the light was soft and golden from the lanterns strung along the main street. And they talked, not about anything of great consequence, the way first real conversations rarely are. She told him about the school and about Rosa Medina and the English letters and the satisfaction of it. He told her about the freight station and the routes that came through Caldwell, and how the cattle trade that had made the town was already shifting as the ranchers pushed further west, and the farmers moved in behind them, and the two groups regarded each other with a mutual wariness that occasionally became something more heated. He said it matter-of-factly, without drama, as someone describing the landscape rather than complaining about it. "Do you worry about the town changing?" she asked. "Change is going to happen whether I worry about it or not," he said. "I'd rather put my energy into what I can actually do." "That is a very practical philosophy," she said. "It's the only one that works," he said, with a small, dry certainty. She looked out at the lantern-lit street, where the fiddler was still playing, and the dancing was still happening, and the children were still running, and Mrs. Beaumont was holding court at the center of a group of women who all appeared to be receiving her opinions on some matter, with a mixture of respect and mild alarm. And she thought that this was a real place with real people in it. A thought that should have been obvious but felt newly important in a way she couldn't quite articulate. She walked back to the boarding house that night under a sky so full of stars it seemed almost aggressive, the kind of sky you never see in Cincinnati, where the smoke from the mills and the ambient light of the city softens everything into a polite glow. The Kansas sky made no such accommodations. It was simply itself, entirely and without apology, and she stood in the yard behind the boarding house for a long time looking up at it, and feeling something she had not felt since she had watched Frederick Holloway's hand cover Adeline Prout's. She felt, for the first time in months, genuinely present inside her own life. August arrived with a heat that was beyond anything in her Cincinnati experience, a dry, flat, relentless heat that made the air shimmer and turned the ground to something close to iron. The children at the school wilted in the afternoons, and Elara, took to moving the later lessons outside under the single large cottonwood tree in the schoolyard, which helped somewhat. She established a routine. She knew the town now, knew its rhythms, the cattle drives that came through in the early weeks of the month, wild and loud and smelling of long distances. The quiet Tuesdays and Wednesdays when the main street was its own self without any particular performance. The Saturday afternoons when farmers came in from the outlying homesteads, and the town briefly expanded and contracted again by Sunday evening. She saw Tom regularly. It was not a large town, and they had developed the easy, familiar shorthand of people who have somehow skipped the awkward middle stage of acquaintance and arrived directly at something more comfortable. He would stop by the schoolyard sometimes on his way past with a freight delivery, not to visit exactly, just to pause, and they would exchange a few sentences about whatever the day held, and then he would go on. She found herself aware of these brief intersections in the way you are aware of something that is becoming important without having formally declared itself, the way you notice a plant growing before it has flowered. It was Mrs. Beaumont who said it first, because Mrs. Beaumont was the kind of woman who said things first. "Tom Greer has been different since you arrived," she told Elara one morning over coffee in the boarding house kitchen, with the casual conversational precision of someone dropping something into water and watching the ripples. Elara looked at her over the rim of her coffee cup. "Different how?" "Less closed in," Mrs. Beaumont said. "He was married once. Did you know that?" She had not known that. She put her coffee cup down. "Her name was Louise," Mrs. Beaumont said, with the measured gentleness of someone who respects both the person they are speaking to and the person they are speaking about. "She died in the winter of '78, fever. They'd been here about 2 years. It was very hard on him. He went back into himself for a good long while afterward." "I didn't know," Elara said. "No reason you would have," Mrs. Beaumont said. "I'm telling you now." The implication hung in the warm kitchen air between them. Elara picked her coffee cup back up and thought about a man leaning against a post office wall with his hat pulled low, patient and quiet, and not going anywhere. She thought about the quality of his attention, that particular completeness of it, the way he listened not only to what you said but to the shape of the silence around it. She thought about a grief carefully tended, carefully kept private. She thought about her own grief, which was considerably smaller. She was old enough and honest enough to know the difference between a broken heart and a broken life, but which had felt enormous from the inside, as smaller griefs always do. She thought about Tom Greer saying, "I spent a few years moving. It gets to feel like running after a while." She did not say any of this to Mrs. Beaumont. She finished her coffee and went to school. But she thought about it all day, between the long division and the geography lesson and the afternoon reading circle. Thought about it with the careful, private quality of something she was not quite ready to put into words. The situation with the school board became a problem in September. Mr. Aldridge had been making visits to the school with increasing frequency, and while his stated reason was to assess the children's progress, which was, she knew, genuinely good, she had begun to notice that his observations focused less on the children and more on her methods, which he invariably found either too lenient or too rigorous depending on his mood. On the third Thursday of September, he arrived during her afternoon session, and sat at the back of the room with the stiff self-importance of a man who expects his presence to alter the room's atmosphere. And it did alter it, because the children, who had been comfortable and engaged in a lively discussion about the history of the territory, became immediately stilted and uncertain in the way children become when an authority figure is observing them with visible judgment. Afterward, when the children had gone, he told her he thought she was spending too much time on what he called extra subjects, by which he meant her history and geography and the additional reading she brought in, and not enough time on the fundamentals that a frontier child genuinely needed. He said this in the tones of a reasonable man making a reasonable observation, but behind it was something that was not entirely about the curriculum, something that was about whether she knew her place and whether he intended to remind her of it. She was polite. She was professional. She gave him nothing he could use and agreed to consider his suggestions. And then, after he left, she sat in the empty schoolroom and felt the particular anger of someone who is very competent at something being told by someone less qualified that they are not doing it correctly. She mentioned it to Tom that evening. She had not entirely planned to. He had come by the boarding house to drop off a parcel that had arrived for her at the freight station, a box of new primers she had ordered from a publisher in St. Louis, and she had thanked him, and they had stood on the boarding house porch, and somehow she had told him about Aldridge and found herself more plainly upset than she had realized she was. Tom listened without interruption. He had the rare quality of being someone who actually lets you finish your thought before he begins constructing his response. Aldridge is the kind of man who's most comfortable when other people are doing things the way he'd do them, he said, which is frustrating because he's not the smartest person in most rooms he's in. He's the chairman of the school board, she said. That doesn't change the assessment. She looked at him and felt the laughter threaten again. I cannot simply disregard him. He has genuine authority over my position. No, he agreed, but you don't have to accept his framing of things. There's a difference between responding to criticism and agreeing with it. She sat with that for a moment. You're rather good at this, she said. At what? Saying the useful thing, she said. Not just the reassuring thing, the actually useful thing. He looked slightly uncomfortable, the way people look when they are recognized for something they have never thought to name. I just say what I think is true, he said. Most people don't, she said. No, he agreed quietly, they don't. She thought about Frederick Holloway, who had said many things that were not true, who had said them fluently and warmly and with great eye contact, and she felt the familiar old ache of it, but it was a degree fainter than it had been, she noticed, which was its own kind of information. She handled Aldridge by doing exactly what she had been doing, because her methods were working. The children's progress was demonstrably good, and she kept careful records that demonstrated it. And when Aldridge visited again in October, she showed him the records with the professional pleasantness of someone who understands that documentation is its own form of argument. He subsided. Not gracefully, but he subsided. October brought the cold that the stove in the schoolroom had been waiting for, and Elara learned to start it an hour before the children arrived and to keep wood nearby. She had asked one of the older boys, a 15-year-old named Cal Worthington, whose family had a ranch south of town, and who had the practical competence of a boy raised to physical work, to help with the wood splitting, and he had done it with the combination of genuine willingness and studied casualness that suggests a young person trying not to appear to be trying to please. She paid him in extra lessons after school, because his reading was weak and he knew it, and wanted it fixed without having to admit he wanted it. She understood that completely. The first real cold came in the second week of October, a quick, sharp drop that reminded everyone that winter on the Kansas plains was not a polite inconvenience but a genuine force of nature that required respect. She added a second quilt to her bed at the boarding house and bought a heavier coat from Hartley's Mercantile and spent a Saturday afternoon helping Mrs. Beaumont put up storm shutters with a competence that surprised Mrs. Beaumont, and that Elara attributed to having grown up with a mother who firmly believed that capable women should understand how to do practical things. Tom had come by to help with the heavier shutters. Mrs. Beaumont's boarding house was a substantial building with some high windows, and the three of them had worked through the Saturday afternoon on it. And Elara had found herself, more than once, handing Tom a tool or a shutter from the inside while he worked from the outside on the ladder. And there was something in the simple, physical, collaborative rhythm of the work that was comfortable in a way that surprised her. The social scaffolding of Cincinnati, the careful management of appearances and social positions, and the way every interaction was at least partly a performance for some imagined audience was entirely absent. There was simply the work, and the cold afternoon air, and two people doing something useful together. Afterward, Mrs. Beaumont made coffee and brought out a pie she had been saving for the occasion, which suggested she had planned for the afternoon's configuration more deliberately than she had implied. But Elara was willing to appreciate the outcome regardless of the engineering. They sat at Mrs. Beaumont's kitchen table with pie and coffee, and the solid satisfaction of a useful afternoon's work. And Tom told them about the freight routes and the changes coming through as the railroad expanded, and what it meant for the towns along the older cattle routes. And Mrs. Beaumont contributed her opinions on the subject with her characteristic combination of humor and precision, and Elara found herself at ease inside the conversation in a way that had been rare in her life. She had always been somewhat formal in social settings, had always managed a distance between herself and the room she was in, but here there was no formality and no distance, and she was simply in it, fully. In the warm kitchen with the pie and the people and the sound of the wind picking up outside. When Tom left and she and Mrs. Beaumont were washing up, Mrs. Beaumont said, "He stayed 2 hours," with the mild satisfaction of a chess player who has made a very good move. "He was helping with shutters," Elara said. "The shutters were done by noon," Mrs. Beaumont said. She did not have an answer for that. She wrote her mother that week. She had been writing every week as promised, keeping the letters warm and informative and carefully curated, telling her mother about the school and the children and the town, avoiding the parts of the story that were either too personal or too unresolved. This week she wrote a little more freely than she had before. She described Tom in the way you describe someone when you are trying to be neutral about them, and therefore are not neutral at all, in the careful, considered way of someone laying words out and checking them for more feeling than she intended to give away. Her mother would read between the lines because her mother always read between the lines. She sent the letter and did not think about it again, which meant she thought about it quite a lot. It was the incident with the cattle outfit in the first week of November that changed something, though she would not have been able to say precisely how or exactly what. A large cattle drive came through Caldwell later than the season usually allowed a rough crew of about 20 men who had been on the trail for 3 months, and who arrived at Caldwell with the particular mood of men who have spent too long in open country with nothing but each other, and the cattle and the weather for company. Caldwell was a trail town and understood this, had an established relationship with the beef trade that was mostly functional and occasionally volatile, and for the most part the crew passed through without incident. But there were 2 men among them who had been drinking since well before they reached the main street, and their particular mode of drunk was the kind that looks for something to demonstrate itself on. She was walking back from the school at 4:30 when they came down the main street louder than the situation required, and one of them, a large man with a red beard, who she subsequently never learned the name of, shouted something at her from across the street that was rude in the specific, casually degrading way of men who have temporarily mislaid their awareness that other people are fully human. She had dealt with this before, and she squared her shoulders and kept walking. Tom came out of the freight station at that moment. He had clearly heard it from inside. He walked across the street without hurry and spoke to the red-bearded man quietly, below her hearing, and the quality of his voice and something in the set of him communicated something she could not hear, but apparently the red-bearded man could, because after a moment of posturing that convinced no one of anything, both men moved on down the street. Tom came across to her. "Are you all right?" he asked. "I'm perfectly fine," she said, and meant it. Though I appreciate, she stopped, because the thing she was appreciating went considerably beyond the incident itself, which she was quite capable of managing, and was about something else, something about being seen and considered and worth someone crossing a street for, and she was not ready to say that. "He's passing through," Tom said simply. "He won't be back." "I know," she said. There was a silence between them that was not awkward but was full of something, the way a room is full of warmth even after the fire has been banked. "Would you like to walk a bit?" he asked. "There's a trail along the river that's good in the evening, before it gets too cold to do it." She was aware that this was something, that it was more than a suggestion about a walk. She was aware that she was aware of it. "Yes," she said, "I would like that." The Chicaskia River at the edge of Caldwell was not the grand river of novels. It was a working river, practical and direct. But in the late afternoon light of early November it was golden and still, and the cottonwoods along its bank had gone to yellow, and were dropping their leaves in the quiet way that always seemed to her more beautiful than the dramatic reds of eastern trees, something honest and uncomplicated about it. They walked along it and talked in the loose, easy way of two people for whom conversation has become genuinely comfortable, the kind of comfort that takes time to build and is worth the time. She told him more about Cincinnati than she had before, not about Frederick, not yet, but about the school there and the mill workers' children and what it had meant to her to teach them, and about the city itself, which she had liked well enough but which had begun to feel like a life she was wearing rather than living. "What changed?" he asked. She considered the question carefully, walking. "I wanted to know if I could," she said finally. "If I could come somewhere genuinely different and build something, whether it was in me." "Is it?" he asked. No rhetoric in it, a real question. She looked at the golden river and the yellow trees and felt the full weight of the last 5 months, the classroom and the children and Rosa Medina reading 4 sentences from the primer and Mrs. Beaumont's kitchen and the Founder's Day dance and the shut-up shutters and this walk in the last warm afternoon light of November. "Yes," she said, "I think it is." He was quiet for a moment, looking at the river. "My wife Louise," he said, "she loved the river. She used to come out here and just stand at the bank and look at it. She said it was the most honest thing in the country." He paused. "I don't come here much anymore. It didn't feel right after she was gone." She understood what it meant that he had come here tonight. She did not say it because it did not need to be said. "I'm sorry you lost her," she said, and meant it completely. "It's been 4 years," he said. "Long enough that I've found my footing again, not so long that I don't still miss her." He looked at Elara with the direct, honest quality that was entirely characteristic of him. But there's a difference between honoring what was and refusing to let anything new in. I learned that slowly. I'm a slow learner sometimes. "I suspect you're a more careful learner," she said. "Maybe," he said, and there was something in his voice that was not quite vulnerability but was adjacent to it, the kind of honesty that costs something. They walked back to town as the light went from gold to violet and the first stars appeared in the great flat Kansas sky, and at the corner of the main street where she turned toward the boarding house he stopped and said, "Elara," in that way he had of saying her name as though it were something worth the saying. "Yes," she said. "I'm glad you came to Caldwell," he said. She looked at him in the early evening light, this man with his steady eyes and his patient, careful attention, and his history of loss, and his quiet, deliberate way of being present in a world that had given him hard things, and that he had chosen, nevertheless, to remain in. "So am I," she said, and she meant that in every possible sense, the full and complicated sense of it, and she thought he understood that because he nodded once, the small, contained nod of a man who has received something he intended to keep. She went inside and sat on the edge of her bed and put her hands in her lap and sat very still for a long time, feeling something she could not quite name, but that was warm and real and present, something that was nothing like the feeling Frederick Holloway had given her, nothing like that giddy, performed quality of falling toward someone who is not actually there to catch you. This was quieter. This was more like the feeling of ground under your feet. She wrote her mother a longer letter than usual. November deepened into proper cold, the kind that had actual teeth, and the town arranged itself around winter with the practical efficiency of people who have learned that the plains will not accommodate wishful thinking about the weather. The school stove earned its keep. The children came in red-cheeked and full of the particular liveliness of cold-weather children, and the classroom became a warm center of the day that Elara loved more than she had expected. Rosa Medina had begun to read with a fluency that was remarkable, and Elara had begun finding her small, careful notes on the corner of Elara's desk, in the morning's observations in her developing English, questions about words, once a small drawing of the schoolhouse with "My School" written underneath in careful block letters that Elara had kept, pressing it flat inside the back cover of her teacher's register. Tom came by the school one afternoon with a delivery, a new globe she had ordered from a cartographer in Kansas City, a modest luxury that had required a certain amount of persuasion for the school board to approve, and stayed to watch her show it to the afternoon class. And the children had gathered around the globe with the fascinated intensity of people who have been given a window onto the vastness of the world, and she had stood next to Tom at the edge of the room and watched them. And when she glanced at him, he was watching the children with the particular expression of someone who finds the moment genuinely moving and does not mind being observed finding it so. "Come to supper on Sunday," she said quietly, while the children were still absorbed in arguing over who got to spin the globe next. He looked at her. "Mrs. Beaumont's. She has offered to cook," Elara said, which was true and not coincidental, because she had discussed this with Mrs. Beaumont, who had offered with alacrity bordering on enthusiasm. "All right," he said. Sunday supper was a long, excellent meal. Mrs. Beaumont was a formidable cook who produced food of a quality disproportionate to the apparent simplicity of her kitchen. And afterward they sat in the parlor and Tom told stories about the early days of Caldwell that were funny and sometimes hard and always honest. And Mrs. Beaumont contributed her own recollections with the vivid specificity of someone who has paid close attention to every year she has lived. And Elara sat in the armchair across from Tom and felt the particular pleasure of watching someone she cared about in a setting where they were comfortable. The way their gestures opened up, the way his laugh came more readily, the deep crinkle of the lines at his eyes. It was after 9 when he left with his hat and his coat and his steady, unhurried manner, and at the door he paused and said, "Thank you," to both of them, and then to Elara specifically he said, "This was good, the whole evening." And the simplicity of it was better than any elaborate compliment could have been. She stood at the window and watched him cross the empty Main Street in the cold night, his breath a brief cloud in the lamplight, and Mrs. Beaumont appeared beside her and said nothing at all, which was its own form of eloquence. The letter from Cincinnati arrived on the 15th of November. It was from her mother, which was normal, but inside her mother's letter was a shorter note, folded separately, which her mother had enclosed without comment. It was from Emily Prout, Adeline Prout's younger sister, who had been among Elara's friends, one of the women she had lost contact with when the whole ugly business had become something everyone in their social circle was carefully not discussing directly. Emily's note was brief and somewhat awkward, as notes are when they are carrying something uncomfortable. Frederick Holloway, it said, had broken off his courtship of Adeline in August. He had been seen calling on a Miss Warren, who was the daughter of a bank investor from Columbus, Ohio. Emily said she was sorry, in the way of someone who is not entirely sorry for sharing the information, and asked how Elara was, and signed it, "Your friend, Emily." Elara sat with the note for a long time in her room. She waited for what she expected to feel, the old ache, the complicated mixture of vindication and grief that she had imagined she would feel when she inevitably heard that Frederick had moved on. She waited for it with the cautious attention of someone who knows from experience that an emotion can be slow to arrive. It arrived, eventually. It was smaller than she had anticipated. The vindication was there, a thin, pale thing. The grief was not grief exactly. It was more like the relief of putting down something heavy you had been carrying for so long that you had forgotten it was heavy, had started to think of it simply as part of yourself. She felt it leave, not dramatically, just quietly, the way things leave when they have finished being necessary. She looked out her east-facing window at the Kansas night. She thought about a man leaning against a station post with his hat pulled low, who had known her name before she introduced herself, who had said it as a certainty and not a question, who had said, "Welcome to Caldwell," in a way that had sounded, in retrospect, oddly like a promise. She folded Emily's note and put it in her stationery box and wrote a brief, friendly reply saying she was well and happy, and that Caldwell was good country, which was nothing but the truth. She saw Tom the next morning because she had gotten into the habit of passing the freight station on her way to school, which was a slightly longer route than the direct one, but which she had been taking for several weeks on the grounds that the light was better on that street in the mornings, which was true, technically, though it was not the only truth. "Good morning," he said, from inside the station door, where he was sorting freight manifests at the high wooden counter. "Good morning," she said, and stopped in the doorway. "Do you have a few minutes?" "Always," he said, setting down the manifests with his characteristic immediate attention. "I received a letter last night," she said, "from an old friend in Cincinnati." She paused, arranging the words because she was still not sure how much she wanted to say. "She mentioned a man, someone I was very fond of once. He's gone on to someone else." Tom looked at her steadily. "How are you with that?" "Better than I expected to be," she said honestly. "Much better, actually, which is its own information, I suppose." "It usually is," he said quietly. She looked at him across the freight counter with its stacked manifests, and the smell of wood and dry goods, and the early morning light coming in through the station windows. And she thought about the word she had been carefully not using for several months now, because it had become associated in her mind with something frightening and unreliable, and she considered whether it was still frightening. And she considered whether what she felt when she looked at Thomas Greer across a freight counter at 7 in the morning was something that required a different word, or whether it might, in fact, be the real version of that same one. "I'm glad you came to Caldwell," she said, and she was deliberately giving his own words back to him, and he heard it that way. She could see it in his eyes. He came around the counter. She had thought in the abstract about what it would be like when this happened, and she had thought it would be perhaps awkward or tentative or complicated by the various feelings and histories that lay between them. She had thought it would require a great deal of navigation. It required very little. He took her hand in both of his, the way you hold something you are genuinely careful with, and looked at her with the direct and unguarded quality that was so entirely characteristic of him that she felt she had always known it was there, even before she had known him at all. "I have been thinking about you," he said, "since June." "Since the station," she said. "Since the station," he agreed. "You knew my name," she said. "The manifest," he said, and the corner of his mouth moved, that contained a genuine small smile, "but I would have remembered it anyway." She believed him. She did not look away from his eyes, which were the warm, dark brown of good soil, and she said, "I came here to forget someone else." "I know," he said. "I've known for a while." "I haven't thought about him in weeks," she said. "I know that too," he said, with the certainty of a man who has been paying close attention. She turned her hand over in his and held his hand properly, fully, and felt the solidity of it, the reality of it, the way this moment was entirely and concretely here, and she said, "I think I would like to stop being careful now." He brought her hand up and held it for a moment, looking at it, her small hand in his larger one, and then he looked at her with something in his eyes that was not the guarded caution she had seen there before, but was open and certain and full. "I think," he said, "that would suit me fine." She went to school that morning with the November light feeling somehow different on the street, with a lightness in her chest that was entirely new and entirely welcome. And she taught the morning's lesson with a concentration that was not impaired in the slightest, but that felt as though it were happening inside something larger than usual, a warmer and more inhabited version of her ordinary day. December arrived. They went on walks. They went to the river, which had a thin skin of ice along its edges now, and was a different kind of beautiful from the golden November version, something spare and silvery and precise. They ate supper at Mrs. Beaumont's on Sundays with a regularity that had become something everyone in Caldwell understood without anyone needing to explain it. She visited the freight station in the mornings and he visited the school in the afternoons, and the town noticed these things with the warm, interested attention that small towns bring to the developing stories of people they care about. Mrs. Clara Beaumont was quietly triumphant and demonstrated this by cooking more than usual and making no comment whatsoever. They talked about everything. She had not, in her adult life, had the experience of someone she could talk to about everything. Her friends in Cincinnati had been warm but surface-focused. Her relationship with Frederick had been built on an elaborate mutual performance, and even her relationship with her mother, which was one of genuine love and closeness, operated within certain comfortable constraints. With Tom, there were no constraints she could identify. She talked about her father, who had died when she was 12, and whom she still missed with the specific, quiet grief of early loss. She talked about her years at the Episcopal school and the particular satisfaction and occasional heartbreak of teaching other people's children. She talked about what she wanted, not the careful edited version of what she wanted that she might have offered a social acquaintance, but the actual version to stay in Caldwell, she said, because the place had gotten into her somehow and she could not imagine wanting to be elsewhere. To keep teaching, because it was who she was and not merely what she did. To have a life that was genuinely hers, built out of things she had chosen. Tom listened to all of it with that full, undemonstrative attention of his, and then he talked about himself with a frankness she understood was not common for him, about Louise and the grief of losing her and the years of quiet that had followed, which he did not describe as lonely, exactly, but as a kind of narrowness, a life that had become very small by necessity. He said he had not expected to want more than that. He said he was grateful, and said it in a way that made it clear that gratitude included her, that she was part of what he was grateful for. She was in love with him. She knew it not the way she had known it with Frederick, which had been a rush and a performance, and a projection of a future she had constructed largely by herself, but the way you know something that has grown slowly and surely in the particular soil of real knowing, not infatuation but recognition, the feeling of finding something you didn't know you had lost until it was there in your hands. Christmas in Caldwell was a proper frontier Christmas. The church was decorated with cedar boughs and paper stars the children had cut out in school, and the town gathered on Christmas Eve for a service that had the particular warmth of community in cold country. People who had built something together in a difficult place, and who were celebrating not just the holiday, but the fact of their own continued existence and mutual investment in each other's welfare. Tom sat beside her in the church pew, and their shoulders touched, and neither of them moved away. And afterward, in the cold outside, he helped her on with her coat with a careful, attentive deliberateness that had nothing to do with practicality. And she thought that the small, specific, real gestures of a real relationship were worth more than any number of elaborate performances. He had made her a gift. He was not. He had told her with the straightforward honesty that characterized everything he did. A man who was good at shopping for things in stores, so he had built her something instead. It was a small bookcase for her room at the boarding house, made from good pine with clean, careful joinery, the kind of thing built by someone who had taken his time and paid attention. On the inside of one of the shelves he had carved, very small and neat, "Welcome to Caldwell, June, 1882. She had stood in her room holding it and felt something so full she had to sit down. Her mother's Christmas letter arrived on the 23rd and was warm and curious and read between the lines of Elara's previous letters with the practiced accuracy of long maternal experience. It ended with, "I believe you are happy, which is all I have wanted for you. Tell me about the man in your next letter, and do not leave anything out." Elara had laughed out loud in her room and immediately begun composing the next letter in her head. January was cold the way Kansas January is cold, uncompromisingly and without apology, and the school's attendance dropped somewhat as the farms farther out became difficult to reach in deep snow. but the town children came consistently, and Elara used the smaller classes to go deeper into things, longer individual sessions with each student, which she valued. Rosa Medina was now reading English with a fluency that had surpassed several of the children a year or two older, and she had begun helping the younger children with their letters in the afternoons, with a natural patience and authority that Elara found remarkable, and told her so directly, because she had learned that Rosa responded to honest recognition far better than to careful, measured praise. She and Tom had their first real disagreement in January. It was, in retrospect, small, but it was real, and it mattered for what it taught them about each other. She had decided, without consulting him, to petition the school board for additional funds for books, specifically for a small library of titles that the children could borrow and take home, something she had been thinking about since the fall, and she had drafted the petition and was about to present it to Aldridge when Tom, who had heard about it through the ordinary social osmosis of a small town, suggested she might want to approach it differently. Bringing in Mr. Hartley and two of the other town merchants as cosigners, which would give it a weight that Aldridge would find harder to dismiss. She had been initially irritated by the suggestion, which felt uncomfortably like being told to root her own idea through other people for legitimacy, and she had said so, with more sharpness than she entirely intended. He had looked at her without defensiveness and said, "That's fair. It's your petition and your school. I should have offered rather than suggested." She had sat with her own sharpness for a moment and recognized in it something she didn't like, not about him, but about herself, a residual brittleness from a year of managing everything alone and being wary of being advised. She said, "You're right that Hartley's support would help. I think what I wanted was to be asked rather than told." "Understood," he said, and meant it. She brought Hartley's support and two other merchants and presented the petition. Aldridge approved it with the air of someone doing a great favor. The library materials arrived in March. The disagreement had done something useful. It had established, quietly and practically, that they could have won, that it did not damage anything fundamental. She thought this was perhaps the most important thing she had learned about love from Frederick Holloway, not the lesson she had thought she was learning at the time, which was something bitter and defensive about trust, but the lesson she had actually needed, which was about what it looked like when something was genuinely solid. February brought a different kind of complication. A man arrived in Caldwell on the 14th. She would remember the date later, which struck her as particularly apt, though the events themselves were not at all romantic, and he came to the freight station asking about a cargo shipment that had been scheduled to come through on the Kansas Pacific the previous autumn and had been rerouted at Tom's direction due to a discrepancy in the manifest. The man's name was Cahill, and he had the smooth, careful manner of someone who is accustomed to resolving disputes through the application of money or intimidation, depending on which proves more efficient. Elara was at the freight station, as she sometimes was in the late afternoon, helping Tom with correspondence. He was entirely capable of handling his own correspondence, but had mentioned once that her handwriting was considerably better than his, which was true, and she had begun helping draft the formal letters to freight companies and rail agents with a quiet efficiency that had quickly become routine. She was at the desk in the corner when Cahill came in and presented himself, and she stayed where she was, partly because leaving would have been conspicuous and partly because some instinct made her want to be a witness. Cahill wanted the original routing manifest, and he wanted it in a way that was not quite demanding, but implied that demanding was available if required. Tom was entirely calm. He produced the documentation with the unhurried competence of someone who keeps excellent records precisely, because he knows situations like this arise, and the documentation was clear. The rerouting had been properly authorized, the discrepancy in the original manifest had been formally noted, and the cargo had been delivered to the correct recipient, all of which was demonstrated in writing. Cahill's smooth manner developed some friction. He said that the correct recipient was a matter of interpretation. Tom said quietly that in Kansas Territory in 1883, a matter of interpretation was a phrase that required a lawyer and a judge, neither of whom was available in this room, and that the documentation was as it was, and he was welcome to pursue whatever course of action he considered appropriate through whatever legal channels he preferred. Cahill left. Tom turned to her after the door closed and the quiet returned to the freight station, and his expression was composed, but she knew him well enough now to read the containment in it, the deliberate management of something that had been a genuine concern. "That was well handled," she said. "He'll probably follow through and there'll be a letter from an attorney in Wichita," Tom said evenly. "But the documentation is sound. We'll be all right." She noted quietly. He looked at her across the freight station. "Yes," he said simply, and it settled between them with all its weight. The lawyer's letter from Wichita arrived in March and was, as Tom had predicted, confrontable with the documentation, and the matter resolved itself with the anticlimactic efficiency of situations where one party simply has the evidence and the other does not. Cahill did not return. Tom noted the whole episode in his records with the characteristic thoroughness that would have impressed even Mr. Aldridge, and life in the freight station returned to its ordinary rhythms. March in Caldwell was the beginning of the landscape's transformation, the plains greening in a way that Elara had not been there long enough to have seen before, and it was more startling and more beautiful than she had expected, the grass coming in over distances so wide you could not find the edges of it, the sky a blue so complete it seemed almost fictional, and the quality of the light doing things that would have kept a painter busy for years. She stood at the edge of the schoolyard on a March afternoon and looked at the plains and felt, viscerally, why people came here, why they stayed. Tom proposed in April. He did it on the riverbank in the early evening of a warm April day when the cottonwoods were putting out their first leaves, small and bright and intensely green, and the river was running high and clear with the melt, and the light was the particular gold of late spring that makes everything look like a memory of itself before it has actually happened. He did not make a speech. He was not a man for speeches. He said, "Elara, I would like for you to stay, not at the boarding house. With me, if you want that." It was not precisely conventional as proposals went. She had imagined at some earlier point in her life a proposal that would be elaborate and romantic in the produced theatrical sense. What she had actually gotten was a man standing on a riverbank looking at her with his entire self present in his face, nothing held back, nothing performed, simply asking her for the real thing, the actual continuing daily thing of two people building a life together. She said, "Yes, that is exactly what I want." He put a ring on her finger that had been his grandmother's, a simple band with a small garnet, and she looked at it on her hand in the late April light and felt the full, settled, certain weight of what she was choosing, and that it was correct and real and hers. Mrs. Beaumont cried, which she denied, saying it was the spring dust, and then cried again more openly when Elara and Tom were not looking, which Mrs. Beaumont also technically denied. Elara wrote her mother a letter that was the longest she had written in her life, and that did not leave anything out. Her mother wrote back in 3 weeks and included in the envelope a pressed flower from the garden and a folded piece of paper that had on it only, "He sounds exactly right," in her mother's distinctive, slanted hand. They were married in June of 1883. Exactly 1 year after Elara had stepped off the train at Caldwell Station with her trunk full of books and her heart in its careful, guarded wrappings. The wedding was held in the church with the cedar boughs replaced by spring flowers, and the whole town, in attendance in the way that small towns come to the weddings of people they have adopted and made their own. Rosa Medina was there with her father, who had become one of Tom's steady freight customers, and who shook Tom's hand at the reception with the particular warmth of a man who has seen something good happen and is glad of it. Cal Worthington came with his whole family from the ranch south of town, scrubbed clean and slightly uncomfortable in his good clothes, and said congratulations, Miss Voss, Mrs. Greer, with the formality of a young man who has decided this occasion deserves his best manners. Emmett Hale, the fiddler, played the wedding dance with feelings about every song he played, as was his nature, and it was exactly right. They had a house. Tom had been living in a small frame house 2 streets from the freight station that he had built himself in the early years, and which he had kept immaculately if somewhat sparsely, the house of a man who had needed function and not decoration. Elara brought the bookcase he had made her and her own things and the accumulated small acquisitions of her year in Caldwell, and they spent the first weeks of their marriage making it jointly theirs in the ordinary, wonderful, specific way of people who are learning how another person takes their coffee, and which side of the bed they prefer, and what sounds they make when they are happy in the morning before they are fully awake. She kept teaching. The school board had briefly, in the person of Mr. Aldridge, raised the question of whether a married woman's continued employment was appropriate, and she had responded to this query with a documented account of her students' progress, and a look that communicated, with perfect civility, that she was prepared to have this conversation in front of all 4 board members simultaneously and would be bringing her records. Aldridge had cleared his throat and withdrawn the question. She had thanked him pleasantly and gone back to school. She also kept the morning visits to the freight station, because they were the natural rhythm of their days and had been before the marriage and saw no reason to change them, and she helped with the formal correspondence, which by now had become a more official role. She kept the freight station's client ledger and correspondence files with a precision that had measurably improved the station's administrative efficiency, which Tom acknowledged with the undemonstrative directness that was entirely him, saying simply, "You're better at this part than I am, and I appreciate it," and the honest simplicity of it meaning more than elaborate tribute could have. The summer of 1883 was hot and full and good. Caldwell grew, new families coming in on the railroad, new businesses on the main street, the town becoming something more than a cattle stop and something less than a city, which was exactly what it wanted to be. The cattle trade was indeed shifting, as Tom had said, but the freight business was diversifying along with it, more agricultural goods and lumber and manufactured supplies as the farming communities expanded, and Tom navigated the change with the same careful, unhurried practicality he brought to everything. Elara's school grew too. The school board, partly at Aldridge's grudging instigation, and partly because the evidence of her results was impossible to ignore, approved the hiring of a second teacher for the younger children in September. A young man fresh from a teacher's college in Missouri named James Whitfield, who was earnest and somewhat overwhelmed, and who Elara took firmly under her wing with the protective authority of someone who has been where he is and knows what he needs. He was a good teacher, once he found his confidence, and the children responded to him well, and by October they had a properly running 2-room school with 60 students between them and a library with 43 books. She found out she was expecting in November of 1883. She told Tom on a Sunday morning before church, sitting at the kitchen table with the particular precision of someone who is carrying something very large and very tender and is not quite sure how to set it down. She said, "I think we are going to have more of ourselves in the world." He was very still for a moment, the way he was still when something was big enough that the normal small containments were not adequate. Then he reached across the table and took her hand and looked at her with an expression she had not seen before, something beyond the warm steadiness she loved in him, something wide and unguarded and deeply moved, and he said, "Are you well? Are you feeling all right?" "I'm very well," she said. "I'm wonderful, actually." He exhaled, slow and full, and she watched the whole landscape of his feelings move across his face: joy, wonder, tenderness, and something underneath it that she recognized as the shadow of his old loss, because he had loved Louise and they had never been able to have children, and he had carried that quietly alongside everything else he carried quietly, and what she was telling him now was touching that too. She covered his hand with her other hand and held both of his between both of hers. "I know," she said quietly. "I'm so happy," he said, and his voice was as stripped down and real as she had ever heard it. "So am I," she said. Her mother came to Caldwell in the spring of 1884, the first time she had traveled west of Ohio in her life, and she arrived with a trunk that was larger than the one Elara had arrived with and full of baby things she had been making, all winter quilts and small garments, and a crocheted blanket in soft cream wool that she had worked on. She confessed, from the day she had received Elara's letter about the baby. She was a tall woman with Elara's eyes and a practical warmth that went very deep, and she shook Tom's hand on the station platform with the assessing thoroughness of a mother who has come a very long way to look at a man who has her daughter's heart. And then she said, "You have good hands. I trust people with good hands," which Tom received with the small contained smile and said, "That is the best thing anyone said to me in a long time, Mrs. Voss." Her mother stayed 6 weeks. She helped prepare the smaller bedroom that Tom had redone over the winter, adding new shelving and better light, and a crib he had made himself with the same careful joinery as the bookcase. She and Mrs. Beaumont became, almost immediately, the kind of friends that certain people become in a short time when they recognize in each other a similar quality of honest, engaged attention to the world, and the two of them together in Mrs. Beaumont's kitchen or in Elara's front parlor were a formidable combination. Warmly, amusingly formidable, the kind of formidable that is made entirely of love and practicality. The baby was born in June of 1884, 2 years almost to the day from the afternoon Elara had stepped off the train at Caldwell Station. He was a boy. They named him Daniel Thomas Greer, Daniel for Elara's father, Thomas for his own. He arrived with the energetic, indignant completeness of newborns, loudly announcing himself to the house and the June morning, and Tom held him with the careful, wondering attention of a man who is holding something he is not sure he deserves and intends to be worthy of regardless. He looked at Elara over the head of their son, this first full morning of Daniel's life, with the full and open expression she had come to love most in him, the one he kept for moments too large for his usual containment, and said nothing for a long time, just looked at her with everything he felt entirely present in his face. "Thank you," he said finally, as inadequate and complete as any 2 words can be. "Both of us managed it," she said, which made him laugh real and warm, and Daniel startled at the sound and then subsided, apparently deciding to accept the world he had arrived in, which seemed on balance to be a reasonably good one. Her mother held Daniel for the first time with the particular stillness of grandmothers, a fullness of feeling so complete it requires quiet to contain, and then she looked up at Elara and said, in the simplest possible voice, "You chose well, my darling. You chose very well." The days that followed were the full, specific, domestic days of new parenthood, the short nights and the long mornings, and the particular depth of feeling that comes with the ordinary care of a small new person who requires everything and gives back a quality of presence that is unlike anything else in the world. Tom was completely present in it. He was the kind of father she had believed he would be from knowing who he was: patient, attentive, genuinely engaged. The kind of man who gets up in the night without being asked because the baby is there and needs something, and the question of whose turn it is seems irrelevant beside the fact. Elara loved him for every instance of it and told him so, because she had learned from the year's education in what genuine love looked like, that saying the real thing mattered. Her mother went back to Cincinnati in August with the crocheted blanket successfully delivered, and a long list of promises to return for Christmas, which she kept, arriving in December of 1884 with another trunk and a determination to teach Tom her recipe for apple cake, which he received with genuine enthusiasm and subsequently became very good at. a fact that pleased Mrs. Beaumont and somewhat astonished the members of the school board who attended a spring gathering at which he produced it. Rosa Medina finished school in the spring of 1885 with the highest marks Elara had given any student, and on the last day of the school year she appeared at Elara's desk after the other children had gone and presented her, with the precise solemnity of a significant occasion, a handmade book, pages sewn together with a neat cover on which Rosa had lettered in her now perfect English, "Stories of My Town," written by Rosa Medina. It was exactly what it said, a collection of small essays about Caldwell and its people, written with the clean, observant prose of someone who has learned to see a place freshly because she came to it from somewhere else. Elara read it that evening and cried without feeling in the least embarrassed about it. Rosa went to work in her father's tannery that summer, as had been planned because the family needed it, which was an injustice of the particular quiet sort that was everywhere in that time and place. The way the children of working families had the option of education taken away not by any law or deliberate cruelty, but simply by the arithmetic of survival, the way ambition and circumstance so often ran perpendicular to each other. Elara and Tom discussed it. She spoke to Mr. Medina on behalf of a school in Wichita that offered a secondary program and that had, she believed, a provision for students who could not pay full fees. It was not a clean solution. The Medinas were not certain, and Rosa was needed, and the situation did not resolve neatly within the pages of any one story. What Elara could do was make sure the door was visible, that Rosa knew it was there, and that the decision was Rosa's own to make when the time was right. The summer of 1885 was good and full, and the town continued its particular process of becoming itself. The cattle trade was diminishing as the barbed wire came in, and the open range closed incrementally, changing the character of the plains in ways that were sometimes painful and sometimes merely practical, and the ranchers and the farmers continued their wary adjustments. Tom navigated the freight business through these changes with the careful steadiness that was his fundamental quality, adding new routes as old ones diminished, building relationships with the farming communities that were settling in along the watercourses, maintaining the freight station as one of Caldwell's reliable anchors through a time of flux. Elara, in the fall of 1885, proposed to the school board an expanded curriculum that included practical sciences and basic bookkeeping, alongside the traditional subjects, arguing with her usual precision and documentation that the children of a changing frontier required skills appropriate to the world they were actually entering. Aldridge objected, with less conviction than he had managed before because his conviction had been eroded over 3 years of being wrong about her competence. The other 3 board members approved the curriculum after a discussion that Aldridge participated in but did not control. She implemented it in the spring term of 1886. James Whitfield, her colleague, was by now a confident and creative teacher, and they worked together with the easy, productive partnership of 2 people who have learned to trust each other's judgment, dividing the expanded curriculum between their classrooms with a genuine collaborative generosity that benefited the children enormously. In the summer of 1886, Tom brought up a conversation they had touched on before but never resolved. He had an opportunity to expand the freight station, a partnership with a man named Archer in Wichita that would extend their routes significantly north and east, requiring more capital and more organizational complexity, but offering considerably more stability and reach. He laid it out for her at the kitchen table after Daniel, now 2 years old and astonishingly opinionated about most things, had been put to bed, spreading out the documents and the figures with the methodical care he brought to significant decisions. She read them carefully. She asked questions. He answered them. They discussed it over 2 evenings and the better part of a Sunday afternoon, and by the end of it they had a shared understanding of the risk and the opportunity and the particular requirements it would make of them, and she said, "I think you should do it," and he said, "I think we should do it," which was the same thing and a different thing simultaneously, and they both knew it. He formalized the partnership with Archer in September of 1886. It was good business and it worked. And within the following year, the expanded freight operation had 3 wagons running and 2 additional employees, and a client list that was considerably longer and more diverse than the original station had maintained. And the Caldwell Freight Station became one of the more significant logistical hubs in southern Kansas, which was a practical and undramatic success, but genuinely satisfying in the way that real work, done well and built honestly, is satisfying. In the winter of 1887, they found out there was to be another baby. This time Tom was less still and more immediately, openly happy, which was itself evidence of how much the years had given him, that the happiness could come first, full and clean, before the complicated shadow of it. He scooped Daniel up and swung him around and told him he was going to have a brother or sister, and Daniel, who was 3½ and had emphatic opinions about everything, announced that he wanted a brother and that his name should be Horse. "We'll discuss the name," Elara said, laughing. The baby came in August of 1887, in the heat of a Kansas summer afternoon, and she was a girl, small and fierce and dark-haired, arriving with the same indignant completeness as Daniel had. They named her Clara Louise Clara for Mrs. Beaumont, who received the news with the magnificent dignity of someone trying very hard not to cry and failing completely, and Louise for Tom's first wife, because Tom had asked if it would be all right, quietly and carefully, and Elara had said yes without hesitation, because the people we have loved and lost are part of us and deserve to be honored, and because the name came from a real place in him that she loved and would not ask him to seal off. "She would have liked you," Tom said once quietly on an October evening when the baby was asleep and Daniel was being put to bed by Grandma Voss, who had come to stay for the autumn. "Louise, she would have liked exactly who you are." Elara looked at him across their kitchen, this man who was her whole ordinary daily life and her great good fortune, this man with his laugh lines and his steady eyes and his patient, careful, honest way of inhabiting the world. "I think," she said, "I would have liked her too." He came and put his arms around her in the kitchen in the lamplight, holding her with the simple solidity of a man who has found where he belongs and intends to stay. And she leaned into it and felt the full weight and warmth of everything they had built, the house and the children and the work and the years, and the quality of it, the genuine, unglamorous, deeply satisfying quality of a real life fully lived. Daniel Thomas Greer grew up to be exactly the combination his name implied: his mother's curiosity and directness, his father's patience and physical ease in the world. A boy who could quote poetry and shoe a horse with equal capability, which Elara considered the most reliable sign of a well-rounded education she could have hoped for. He read everything he could get his hands on and argued about it with the passionate specificity of someone who cares about ideas, and he helped his father at the freight station with the genuine enthusiasm of a boy who has grown up watching work, done with skill and integrity, and wants to understand how it is done. Clara Louise was, from the very beginning, herself fierce and clear-eyed and deeply social, with a gift for reading people that seemed almost uncanny in someone so young, the quality of attention that made adults feel thoroughly seen and somewhat assessed. She had her father's steadiness and her mother's directness, and from Mrs. Beaumont she appeared to have inherited, through sheer proximity and considerable love, the particular combination of warmth and precision that was Mrs. Beaumont's essential quality. Rosa Medina did go to the school in Wichita, as it turned out, in the spring of 1888, when her younger brother was old enough to take over her role in the tannery. Her father brought her the possibility as a gift, quietly, and she came to tell Elara the morning she decided, standing in the school doorway before the students arrived with the look of someone who knows this is an important moment and wants to share it with the right person. "You made me believe I could," Rosa said, with the directness of someone who has learned that gratitude is best given plainly. Elara took her hands. "You always could," she said. "I just showed you the mirror." Rosa went to Wichita in September of 1888. She wrote Elara letters, careful and vivid, and full of the same observant quality as the handmade book she had given her on the last day of school, and Elara kept every one of them in a box on the shelf beside Daniel's carved bookcase. Mrs. Clara Beaumont died in the winter of 1889, peacefully, in her own bed in the boarding house she had run for 19 years, surrounded by the people she had made her family. She was 72 years old, and she had lived completely and without apology, and she had known, with the clarity of someone who had built something real in a difficult place, that she had done something worth doing. Tom and Elara sat with her in the last days, and Tom held her hand on the last evening with the same quality of full, undemonstrative presence that had always been most characteristic of him, and she had looked at him and then at Elara and said, "Well, I did all right, didn't I?" And they had both said yes, meaning it entirely, and she had closed her eyes with the satisfied expression of someone who has come to a good conclusion. The boarding house was left in her will to Elara with a note that said, "You were exactly what this town needed. So was he. Keep making things grow." Elara read it sitting at her own kitchen table with Tom across from her, and wept honestly and without embarrassment for a good long while, and Tom brought her coffee and sat with her and let it be what it was. They kept the boarding house as a boarding house, because Mrs. Beaumont would have wanted that a new family ran it, with Tom managing the property, and it continued to be what it had been, a warm, no-nonsense harbor for people arriving in Caldwell in need of a place that felt like something. In the spring of 1890, 8 years after Elara had stepped off the train at Caldwell Station with her heart carefully wrapped and her face set toward a future she could not yet see, she stood in the schoolyard on a warm April afternoon watching her students come and go in the late light, and Tom came by with the freight wagon on his way back from a delivery, and he stopped and climbed down and came to stand beside her at the schoolyard fence the way he had done countless times in those 8 years. Shoulder to shoulder, looking at the same thing. "Good day?" he asked. "Very good," she said. "Cal Worthington's son started today, 7 years old, exactly as serious as his father." Tom smiled at that, the full version of it. "Cal will like that assessment. I'll tell him at church." They stood in the warm April afternoon with the schoolyard in front of them, and the wide Kansas sky above, and the sounds of the town going about its business around them. And she thought about a train platform in June of 1882, and a man who had known her name before she said it, who had spoken it with the quiet certainty of someone who keeps the things that matter. And she thought about everything that name had become, everything that had grown from that single moment of being known. She put her hand through his arm and leaned against his shoulder, and he covered her hand with his in the warm and present way he always had, and they stood there together in the full light of an ordinary, extraordinary afternoon, and it was exactly right, and it was exactly enough, and it was theirs. The years continued to arrive and be inhabited. Daniel at 12 was reading philosophy borrowed from the lawyer's office and arguing about it at the supper table with an intellectual passion that Tom met with genuine engagement and occasional gentle challenge. And Elara looked at the two of them across the table, her husband with his patient, considered responses and her son with his bright, demanding questions, and felt something so rich and complete that she had no better word for it than gratitude. Clara Louise at 3 was a full and organized person with opinions about everything, and a particularly exact understanding of which of her strategies worked best on which parent, which Elara recognized with the professional clarity of someone who has taught several hundred children and knows when someone is being strategic, and which she could not entirely resist anyway because Clara was very good at it. The school became, over those years, something genuinely remarkable for a frontier town, not a grand institution but a good one, the kind of school that takes children seriously and gives them real tools, that asks things of them and believes in their capacity to deliver. Elara was known through southern Kansas as one of the most effective teachers in the territory, which brought her a flattering offer from a school in Wichita in 1891 that she declined with the straightforward simplicity of someone who knows where they belong. She told Tom about the offer that evening, adding only that she had declined it. He looked at her with the particular expression she had come to associate with his deepest feelings, that open, unguarded quality. "I would have followed you," he said. "If you had wanted to go." She looked at him steadily. "I know," she said. "That's part of why I didn't need to." He looked at her for a long moment. "Elara," he said, and in the way he said it, with that same quality she had first noticed on a train platform in June of 1882, as though her name were something worth keeping. "I know," she said again, more softly, and meant it in every possible direction. In the summer of 1892, exactly 10 years after she had arrived, there was a small celebration, not planned exactly, but accumulated, the way genuine celebrations are, through the affectionate insistence of a community that has claimed you. The Founders' Day that summer coincided with the school's anniversary, and someone, probably James Whitfield, who had by now been in Caldwell for 9 years, and had a wife and 2 children, and had become one of the town's most beloved citizens, organized a tribute to Miss Elara Voss, Mrs. Elara Greer. That began with a formal acknowledgement from the school board. Mr. Aldridge had retired 2 years prior, and his replacement was a considerably more sensible man named Foster, and expanded naturally into the kind of warm, specific, affectionate testimony that comes from a community that has been genuinely shaped by someone's presence. Students stood up and told about things she had taught them. Not just facts or skills, but ways of looking, the habit of questioning, the practice of attention, the belief in their own capacity that she had given them by refusing to pretend it was not there. Cal Worthington, now a full-grown man running his family's ranch and serving on the town council, said that she had taught him to read properly at age 15, and he had never underestimated the weight of that. Rosa Medina's father, in the crowd, had his daughter's latest letter in his vest pocket, a letter from Wichita where Rosa was now teaching herself in the school she had attended, a fact that made Elara press her lips together hard against the feeling of it. Tom stood at the edge of the gathering and watched, and did not say anything in the formal portion, because he was not a man for formal speeches. But afterward, when the crowd had dispersed into the broader celebration, and the fiddler was playing, and the children were running, and the lanterns were going up in the summer evening, he found her at the edge of things in the place she often went when she wanted a moment of quiet observation, and he stood beside her and put his arm around her and said, "10 years." With a fullness in his voice that contained everything, all of it, the whole accumulation of their ordinary and extraordinary life together. "10 years," she said. "Do you remember the station?" he asked. "Every detail," she said. "You looked like someone who was trying to be fine," he said, "and was mostly succeeding." She laughed softly. "I was trying very hard." "I thought," he said, "that was the most honest expression I'd seen on anyone in a long time." She looked up at him. "And what did you think would happen?" He considered this with his characteristic careful honesty. "I thought," he said, "that here was someone worth knowing. I didn't let myself think past that." "And now?" she asked. He looked down at her with the full, warm, unguarded expression that was his most private and his most genuine face, the one she had the particular privilege of knowing. "Now," he said, "I think I was exactly right." The fiddler played a waltz, and they danced on the main street of Caldwell, Kansas, on a summer evening in 1892. In the town she had come to forget someone else and had instead found herself, had instead found him, had instead found a life that was so thoroughly and completely hers that she could no longer imagine any of the other paths she might have taken, could no longer feel the shape of the grief that had brought her here except as the very faintest outline of something that had served its purpose beautifully. A grief that had been, in the end, nothing more than a road, and the road had led here, and here was everything. Daniel stood at the edge of the dancing with Clara on his hip, his 10-year-old competence managing his 3-year-old sister with the responsible ease of a boy who takes the things he cares about seriously. And he watched his parents dance with the uncomplicated pleasure of a child who has grown up in a happy house and takes happiness as the natural condition of the world, which was the finest thing Elara knew about the life they had built. The Kansas stars came out as they always did, without accommodation or apology, blazing and complete across the enormous sky, and the music played, and the town celebrated its continued existence with the genuine feeling of people who know what it costs and value it accordingly. And Thomas Greer held his wife's hand as they danced, and knew himself to be a man who had been given back something he had not expected, and had tried every day since to be worthy of it. Elara looked at the sky and felt the full measure of her own life in her, all of it, the loss that had come before and the journey west, and the name spoken with quiet certainty on a train platform, and the years of building and the children and the teaching and the mornings and the river and the ordinary daily life that was the actual substance of everything. And she thought, this is what it is. Not the falling, not the performance, not the version of love that requires you to disappear into someone else's idea of you. This particular full and present life, with this particular man, in this particular beautiful and difficult and genuine place. This was what she had come west to find, even though she had not known it, even though she had told herself she had come for entirely different reasons. She had come west to forget a broken heart. She had found at the station a man who remembered her name. And from that first small certainty, her name, spoken as something worth keeping, everything else had grown, real and deep and lasting. The way the best things grow when they are planted in honest ground by people who are willing, finally, to stay.